The wrestling world just witnessed something that nobody saw coming, and what happened has left fans absolutely speechless because Paul Heyman found himself in a position he never imagined possible. The Wiseman who has always stood behind the most dominant forces in professional wrestling was reduced to begging for his life, and the desperation in his voice was real as Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose closed in on him with intentions that were anything but friendly. If you want to see how this entire situation unfolded and why Heyman was left pleading for mercy, then you need to stick around because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about loyalty and betrayal in the wrestling business. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now because you don't want to miss any of the explosive content coming your way. The scene opened in the backstage area where Paul Heyman was nervously pacing back and forth, checking over his shoulder every few seconds like a man who knew something terrible was about to happen. His usual confidence was completely gone and replaced by genuine fear that radiated from every movement he made. The halls were dimly lit, creating shadows that seemed to move and shift with every passing second, making the atmosphere even more tense than it already was. Heyman clutched his phone in one hand, constantly glancing at the screen as if hoping for some miracle message that would save him from what was coming. His breathing was heavy and you could see the sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the arena. This was not the Paul Heyman that fans were used to seeing standing confidently beside his clients delivering promos with unmatched charisma. This was a man who knew he had crossed a line and now the consequences were closing in fast. Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose had been hunting for Heyman ever since they discovered what he had done, and their determination to find him was written all over their faces. The two former Shield brothers were back together with a singular focus that made them more dangerous than ever before. Roman moved through the corridors with the calm, measured steps of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. His jaw was set tight and his eyes scanned every corner with precision, looking for any sign of the man who had betrayed their trust. Ambrose, on the other hand, was pure chaos, barely contained as he walked alongside Roman with an unpredictable energy that made everyone they passed step quickly out of their way. His hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly, showing just how eager he was to get his hands on Heyman and make him pay for what he had done. The two of them together created an unstoppable force, and everyone backstage knew that when they found Heyman things were going to get brutal. Heyman rounded a corner and came face to face with a dead end, realizing too late that he had trapped himself in a section of the arena with no easy escape routes. Panic flooded through him as he spun around looking for another way out, but the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway told him it was already too late. He pressed himself against the wall, hoping maybe somehow he could blend into the shadows and avoid detection, but his labored breathing gave away his position. The footsteps grew louder and closer until finally Roman Reigns emerged from around the corner, his towering frame filling the narrow hallway and blocking any chance Heyman had of running past him. Right behind Roman came Dean Ambrose, whose wild eyes locked onto Heyman with an intensity that made the manager's blood run cold. There was nowhere left to run, and Heyman knew that his time had finally come. Roman took a step forward and Heyman immediately threw up his hands in a gesture of surrender, his voice cracking as he began to speak. He started rambling, trying to explain himself and justify whatever actions had brought them to this moment, but his words came out in a jumbled mess of excuses and half-truths. Heyman tried to appeal to their past relationship, reminding Roman of all the times he had stood by his side and helped him reach the top of the wrestling world. He mentioned their history together and how he had always been loyal to Roman even when others had turned their backs on him. But Roman's expression remained cold and unmoved by any of Heyman's desperate pleas. Ambrose circled around to Heyman's other side, effectively cutting off any potential escape route, and his presence only added to the terror that Heyman was experiencing. The manager's voice grew more frantic as he realized his words were falling on deaf ears and that nothing he said was going to change what was about to happen. Heyman dropped to his knees in a last-ditch effort to show his submission and beg for mercy from the two men who now stood over him. Tears began streaming down his face as he clasped his hands together in a pleading gesture that would have seemed almost comical if not for the genuine fear behind it. He begged them to remember the good times, to think about everything they had accomplished together, and to consider showing him some compassion. His voice broke multiple times as he spoke, and you could hear the raw emotion in every word he uttered. He promised them anything they wanted, swearing that he would make things right and that he would never cross them again if they just gave him this one chance. But Roman and Dean exchanged a look between them that said everything without needing any words. They had made their decision long before they found Heyman, and no amount of begging was going to change their minds now. The entire situation stemmed from a betrayal that had rocked the foundation of trust between these three men, and understanding what led to this moment is crucial to grasping why Roman and Dean were so intent on making Heyman pay. Heyman had been working behind the scenes, making deals and arrangements that directly went against the interests of Roman Reigns and by extension Dean Ambrose, who had recently reunited with his Shield brother. The specifics of the betrayal involved Heyman allegedly feeding information to their rivals and setting up scenarios that would benefit his own interests rather than those of the men he was supposed to be representing. When Roman discovered what Heyman had been doing, his anger was immediate and intense, because betrayal from someone he considered part of his inner circle cut deeper than any attack from a known enemy. Dean's reaction was equally furious, because even though his relationship with Heyman was less direct, the principle of loyalty meant everything to him, and seeing Roman hurt by someone who was supposed to be trusted made his blood boil. Roman crouched down so he was at eye level with the kneeling Heyman, and his voice when he spoke was low and filled with a controlled fury that was somehow more terrifying than if he had been shouting. He told Heyman exactly what he thought of his betrayal and how disappointed he was that someone he had elevated and protected had turned around and stabbed him in the back. Every word Roman spoke was carefully chosen, designed to cut through Heyman's defenses and make him understand the magnitude of what he had done. Heyman tried to interject to explain his side of things, but Roman's hand shot up in a silencing gesture that made it clear he had no interest in hearing any more excuses. Dean stood behind Roman, cracking his knuckles and rolling his shoulders, clearly itching to get physical but holding back for the moment to let Roman have his say. The tension in the air was so thick you could almost feel it pressing down on everyone in that hallway, and it seemed like at any second things were going to explode into violence. What made this situation even more intense was the history between all parties involved, because Roman and Paul Heyman had worked together during some of the most significant periods of Roman's career. Heyman had been there when Roman was establishing himself as the tribal chief, helping to craft the narrative and give voice to Roman's dominance in a way that elevated both of them. Their partnership had seemed unbreakable to outsiders, and many fans had assumed that Heyman's loyalty to Roman was absolute. But somewhere along the way things had changed, and Heyman had made decisions that put his own interests ahead of Roman's, which was the ultimate sin in the code that Roman lived by. Dean Ambrose brought his own complicated history to the situation, having been part of the Shield alongside Roman and understanding the brotherhood that came with that bond. When the Shield was together, loyalty was everything and betrayal was simply not tolerated, which is why Dean had no sympathy for what Heyman was going through now. Heyman continued his desperate pleas, trying every angle he could think of to get through to the two men who seemed determined to make him suffer. He appealed to their business sense, arguing that destroying him would not benefit anyone and that they could all still work together to achieve great things. He reminded them of the money they had made together and the moments they had created that fans would remember forever. He even tried to play on their emotions, bringing up personal details and moments that he thought might soften their resolve. But nothing was working, and with each failed attempt Heyman's desperation grew more pronounced. His suit was rumpled and disheveled from his frantic movements, and his carefully styled hair had fallen out of place, giving him an appearance that was completely at odds with the polished advocate character he usually portrayed. It was a stunning fall from grace to see someone who had always been so composed and in control reduced to this state of absolute terror. Dean finally stepped forward, unable to contain himself any longer, and his voice when he spoke was dripping with contempt for the man cowering before them. He told Heyman that people like him were exactly what was wrong with the wrestling business, always looking for an angle, always trying to get one over on someone, even if it meant betraying the people who had given them everything. Dean's words were harsh and unfiltered, reflecting his no-nonsense personality and his unwillingness to tolerate people who operated without honor or loyalty. He circled around Heyman like a shark sizing up his prey, and you could see Heyman flinch every time Dean moved closer to him. The psychological torture was almost worse than any physical punishment they could have inflicted, because Heyman was being forced to confront his own actions and the consequences that came with them. Roman watched Dean's display with approval, letting his brother speak his piece before they decided what would come next. The confrontation represented something larger than just this one incident, because it spoke to the themes of loyalty and betrayal that run throughout professional wrestling, and particularly through the story of the Shield and its members. When Roman and Dean had first come together as part of the Shield along with Seth Rollins, they had made a pact to always have each other's backs no matter what. That bond had been broken when Seth betrayed them, which led to years of animosity and conflict. Eventually there had been reunions and reconciliations, but the scars from that original betrayal never fully healed. Now here was another betrayal from someone who had been brought into Roman's inner circle, and it brought back all those old wounds. For Roman, this was about establishing once and for all that betrayal would not be tolerated and that anyone who crossed him would face serious consequences. For Dean, it was about supporting his brother and upholding the code of loyalty that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Heyman's begging reached a fever pitch as he realized that nothing he said was going to save him from whatever Roman and Dean had planned. He started making wild promises, offering them anything and everything he could think of if they would just let him walk away. He said he would disappear and never show his face around them again. He offered to give them information about other wrestlers and their plans. He even suggested he could help them destroy their enemies if they just gave him the chance to prove himself again. But every offer was met with stony silence from Roman and a mocking laugh from Dean, who seemed to find Heyman's desperation almost amusing. The more Heyman talked, the more pathetic he sounded, and it became clear that he had completely lost any leverage or power he once held. This was a man who had been stripped of everything that made him formidable, and all that remained was fear and desperation. Roman finally stood up to his full height, looking down at Heyman with an expression that was impossible to read. The moment stretched out, feeling like an eternity as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Heyman looked up at Roman with pleading eyes, still hoping for some sign of mercy but finding none in the tribal chief's face. Dean moved in closer from the other side, creating a wall of intimidation that left Heyman feeling completely trapped and helpless. The two men exchanged one more look between them, and then Roman gave a slight nod that seemed to signal their next move. Heyman's eyes went wide with terror as he realized his time had run out and whatever mercy he had been begging for was not going to be granted. The hallway seemed to close in around them as the inevitable conclusion of this confrontation approached, and everyone watching knew that Paul Heyman was about to learn a very painful lesson about the cost of betrayal. What this moment really represented was a turning point in the ongoing saga of Roman Reigns and his allies, because it showed that Roman was willing to hold even his closest associates accountable when they stepped out of line. For too long Heyman had operated with the assumption that his value to Roman would protect him from any consequences, but that assumption had proven to be completely wrong. Roman's willingness to punish even someone as important as Paul Heyman sent a clear message to everyone else in his circle that loyalty was not optional and that betrayal would be dealt with swiftly and severely. Dean's involvement added another layer to the situation because it showed that the Shield Brotherhood still meant something even after all these years, and that Roman could count on Dean to back him up when it mattered most. Together they represented a force that was greater than the sum of their parts, and Heyman had made the fatal mistake of underestimating just how dangerous that combination could be. The aftermath of this confrontation would ripple through the entire wrestling landscape, affecting storylines and relationships in ways that nobody could have predicted. Heyman's position as a manager and advocate had always been built on his reputation for intelligence and strategic thinking, but this incident had exposed a fatal flaw in his character. His willingness to betray Roman for personal gain had backfired spectacularly, and now he was paying the price for that decision. Whether Heyman would be able to recover from this humiliation and rebuild his reputation remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. His relationship with Roman Reigns was permanently damaged, and any future interactions between them would be colored by this moment of betrayal and the subsequent begging for mercy. Dean Ambrose had reasserted himself as someone who would always stand by his brothers, and his role in this confrontation had reminded everyone why he was considered one of the most dangerous competitors in the business. And Roman Reigns had once again proven why he was the tribal chief and why crossing him was a mistake that nobody should ever make. The image of Paul Heyman on his knees begging for mercy while Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose stood over him will be remembered as one of those defining moments that perfectly captured the ruthless nature of professional wrestling at its core. It was a moment that stripped away all pretense and showed the raw human emotions of fear, regret, and retribution playing out in real time. For fans who had followed these characters for years, it was both shocking and satisfying to see justice being served, even if the method was brutal. The hunting of Paul Heyman by Roman and Dean had reached its conclusion, and the Wiseman had learned that even his silver tongue and quick thinking could not save him when he had betrayed the trust of men who valued loyalty above all else. This was wrestling at its most intense and visceral, and nobody who witnessed it would forget the sight of Heyman's desperate pleas falling on deaf ears as his fate was sealed. If you made it this far, then you understand why this moment was so significant and why it sent shockwaves through the entire wrestling community. The story of betrayal, loyalty, and retribution played out in that hallway is what makes professional wrestling so compelling, and why fans continue to invest emotionally in these characters and their journeys. Make sure you subscribe to stay updated on all the latest developments, because situations like this prove that in wrestling anything can happen, and the most powerful people can fall from grace in an instant when they make the wrong choices. The saga of Roman Reigns, Dean Ambrose, and Paul Heyman is far from over, and what comes next will be just as explosive as what we witnessed here today, so don't miss out on any of the action by subscribing right now.